Some folks say the loneliest sound in the world is your own voice echoing back from empty mountains. For Eli Boone, that echo had been his only companion for 15 long years. The 60-year-old mountain man lived alone in the Colorado Rockies, carrying regrets heavier than his winter coat. One day, in the dying mining town of Cedar Falls, he found a massive, scarred dog chained behind the general store. The beast was mean as a rattlesnake, snarling at everyone who passed. 3 owners had given up on the animal, and the sheriff wanted it put down. But when Eli looked into those angry eyes, he saw something he recognized. For 25 cents, he bought the most dangerous dog in the territory. What happened next changed both their lives forever. But could a broken man and a broken dog really save each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat on a rocky ledge 8,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin enough to remind a man he was mortal and the silence deep enough to swallow his sorrows whole. Eli Boone had built it with his own hands 15 years ago, using timber from trees that had watched over these mountains longer than any human settlement below. The structure was solid, practical, and utterly alone, much like the man who called it home. Every morning, Eli woke to the same ritual. Coffee, black as coal mine darkness, heated over a wood-burning stove that crackled with the authority of something real in a world that had become too fragile for his liking. He'd sit on his porch, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup that had seen more sunrises than most folks saw birthdays, and he'd watch the valley spread out below him like a rumpled quilt thrown across the earth. The weathered journal lay open beside him on most mornings, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, sketches of mountain flora mixed with weather observations, written in his careful, deliberate script. Wind from the northwest, storm coming by evening. Found bear tracks near the creek. Mother with cubs. Simple notations that marked the passage of days when human conversation had become a luxury he'd forgotten how to afford, but the journal held more than weather patterns and wildlife sightings. Scattered throughout its pages were entries that revealed the gradual erosion of a man's connection to the world beyond his mountain sanctuary. Early entries mentioned trips to town, conversations with neighbors, plans for the future. As the years progressed, the entries grew shorter, more focused on survival and solitude. The last human interaction he'd recorded was 3 months old, a brief exchange with Murphy at the general store about the price of flour. Eli hadn't always been a hermit. Time was, he'd been the kind of man other men looked to when trouble came. Calling. As a mining foreman in the copper camps of Leadville, he'd led crews through some of the most dangerous work a man could do for honest pay. He understood rock formations the way some men understood horses or crops, could read the mountain's moods in the way or veins ran through granite, could sense when the earth was ready to give up its treasures or claim a few lives in payment. That understanding had saved dozens of men over the years. But it hadn't been enough to save the ones who mattered most. The memory always came back sharp as winter wind, no matter how many years passed or how much distance he put between himself and that terrible day. Martha had been visiting the mine. Office, bringing him lunch as she did every Tuesday, their little ritual of shared time in his workday world. Their son Tommy, just turned 8, had begged to come along, fascinated by the great machines and the stories of underground adventures. His father brought home. Eli had been deep in the tunnel system when he felt it, that subtle shift in the mountain's breathing that meant trouble. He'd started shouting orders, getting his men out, but the collapse came faster than even his experienced instincts had predicted. By the time he fought his way back to the surface, the office building had been buried under 10,000 tons of rock and debris. They never found the bodies. The mountain had taken his family as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving him with nothing but the echo of Tommy's laughter and the memory of Martha's smile. The other miners had called. It an act of God, a tragedy no man could have prevented. The company offered compensation, sympathy, and a new position at another site. Eli had taken his savings, bought supplies, and disappeared into the Rockies. For 15 years, he'd lived by a simple code. Take only what you need. Give the mountain its due respect, and never let yourself care about anything you can't bear to lose. His cabin provided shelter, his gardens and hunting provided food, and the vast wilderness provided all the company he figured a man like him deserved. The town of Cedar Falls lay 8 miles down a winding mountain trail, far enough away that he could go months without seeing another human face, close enough that he could get supplies when his stores ran low. It was a dying place, kept alive only by stubbornness and the fact that some folks had nowhere else to go. The copper mine that had given the town its reason for being had played out 5 years back, leaving behind empty buildings and empty dreams. Murphy ran the general store with the resigned efficiency of a man tending a graveyard. A thick-bodied Irishman with kind eyes and hands stained permanently black from years of handling everything from lamp oil to penny candy. He'd never asked Eli uncomfortable questions about his past or his reasons for living alone on the mountain. Their conversations stayed safely in the present tense. Weather, supplies, the occasional piece of news from the outside world that Murphy thought might interest a customer who lived like a man from another century. Sheriff Hawkins was cut from different cloth entirely. A political appointment who'd bought his way into the job when the last sheriff died of consumption. Hawkins had the soft hands and calculating eyes of a man who viewed law enforcement as a business opportunity rather than a calling. He tolerated Eli's presence in his jurisdiction with the wary respect that predators show each other. When neither wants to start a fight, they might not finish. But Dr. Sarah Chen was something else altogether. She'd arrived in Cedar Falls 2 years ago, fresh from medical school in Denver, full of idealistic notions about bringing modern medicine to frontier communities. Most folks had expected her to last a season before the isolation and hardship sent her scurrying back to city life. Instead, she dug in like a mountain pine, adapting to the harsh realities of frontier medicine with a grace that had earned even the most skeptical residents' respect. Eli had encountered her only twice, both times when mountain accidents had forced him to seek medical attention he couldn't provide for himself. A dislocated shoulder from a fall while hunting, and a deep cut from a saw blade that had turned infected despite his best efforts. Both times, she'd treated him with professional competence and a carefully maintained distance that told him she understood he wasn't the kind of man who appreciated prying questions or offers of friendship, but he'd noticed the way she looked at him, not with pity or curiosity, but with the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to carry heavy burdens alone. There was something in her careful composure that suggested she'd done her own share of running from things too painful to face directly. The dog had been chained behind Murphy's store for 3 days when Eli made his monthly supply run. A massive creature, easily 120 pounds, with the broad chest and powerful jaw of something bred for fighting. Its coat was a patchwork of scars and healing wounds, evidence of a hard life lived at the wrong end of human cruelty. The chain around its neck had worn the fur away, leaving raw patches that spoke of months of confinement. Devil Dog, they're calling him, Murphy had explained, shaking his head as he tallied Eli's purchases. Came through with a traveling trader who couldn't handle him anymore. Man said the beast had killed 2 other dogs and put 3 men in the doctor's care. Nobody wants the thing, but nobody's got the stomach to put it down either. Eli had studied the animal while Murphy spoke. The dog was watching him too, yellow eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that went beyond simple animal awareness. There was intelligence there and pain and something else, a kind of fierce pride that even chains and abuse hadn't been able to break. "What's the trader want for him?" Eli had asked. Murphy had laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Quarter, says." He just wants the chain back and the problem off his hands. But Eli, that animal's dangerous. Sheriff's been talking about having it shot before it hurts somebody. Eli had looked at the dog again, seeing something in those yellow eyes that reminded him of his own reflection in the cabin's mirror on the worst days. The look of a creature that had been hurt so deeply that it trusted nothing and expected nothing except more pain. "I'll take him," he'd said, reaching into his pocket for the coin. The transaction had taken less than 5 minutes. Murphy had removed the chain with nervous efficiency while the dog stood perfectly still, as if it understood that this moment would determine its fate. Eli had fashioned a rope lead from his supplies and stood waiting to see what would happen next. The dog had looked at him for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to weigh possibilities and calculate odds. Then it had taken a single step forward, not in submission, but in what looked remarkably like a conscious decision to see where this new path might lead. The walk back to the cabin had taken 4 hours instead of the usual 2. The dog, Eli found himself already thinking of it as Moses, though he couldn't say exactly why, had stopped frequently to test the boundaries of this new arrangement. Sometimes it would strain against the rope, testing Eli's strength and resolve. Other times it would lag behind, forcing Eli to adjust his pace. But always those yellow eyes stayed fixed on Eli's face, reading his intentions with the careful attention of a creature that had learned to survive by understanding the moods and motivations of the humans who controlled its fate. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded Eli why he'd chosen this particular spot to make his stand against the world. Moses had settled into a watchful crouch near the porch steps, close enough to observe, but far enough away to run, if this new human proved to be just another source of pain. Eli had set out a bowl of water and some jerky, then retreated to his porch to let the dog decide. What came next? As darkness fell over the mountain, he'd sat in his rocking chair and watched Moses make his first tentative approaches to the food and water. For the first time in 15 years, Eli Boone wasn't entirely alone on his mountain. Whether that would prove to be a blessing or a catastrophe remained to be seen, but as he listened to the dog settling into an uneasy sleep near his cabin, he found himself wondering if perhaps the echo of his own voice wasn't the only sound these mountains had to offer after all. The first night passed without incident, but Eli woke to find his new companion had moved closer to the cabin during the dark hours. Moses lay curled near the front door, positioning himself like a sentinel, between the interior and the mountain wilderness beyond. When Eli emerged for his morning routine, the dog's eyes tracked his every movement with the focused attention of a creature calculating distances and escape routes. "Morning," Eli said quietly, testing whether his voice would trigger aggression or flight. Moses's ears twitched forward, but he remained motionless, yellow eyes never leaving Eli's face. It was a start. The real test came when Eli began preparing breakfast. The smell of bacon frying in his cast-iron skillet brought Moses to his feet, every muscle tense with anticipation. 15 years of solitary living had taught Eli to cook for one, but he found himself cutting an extra portion and setting it aside to cool. "Reckon you're hungry," he said, placing the meat in the wooden bowl he'd carved the night before. The simple act of creating something specifically for another living creature had felt strange under his hands, like a skill he'd forgotten he possessed. Moses approached the bowl with careful steps, never taking his eyes off Eli. The first bite was tentative, testing for poison or trickery. When none came, the dog ate with the desperate efficiency of an animal that had learned to expect its meals to be interrupted by violence. That was when Eli noticed the extent of the damage. Beneath the matted fur and surface scars lay evidence of systematic abuse that made his stomach clench with familiar rage. The dog's ribs showed too clearly, speaking of meals withheld as punishment. Old bite marks on his muzzle suggested fights with other dogs, probably arranged for gambling. Most telling were the healed breaks in what had once been a magnificent tail, now crooked from injuries that had never received proper care. "What did they do to you?" Eli murmured, and Moses froze at the sound of human words spoken in anger. The dog's hackles rose, and he backed away from the food bowl, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Eli raised his hands slowly, recognizing the signs of an animal expecting punishment for triggering human displeasure. "Easy, boy. Wasn't talking about you, talking about them." But the damage was done. The fragile trust of the morning shattered like ice on a spring pond. Moses bared teeth that could crush bone, his yellow eyes now burning with the feral intelligence of a creature that had survived by expecting the worst from every human encounter. The attack came without further warning. Moses launched himself across the cabin floor with the explosive power of a creature bred for combat. Eli had just enough time to throw up his arms before 120 pounds of scarred muscle and righteous fury slammed into his chest, driving him backward into his kitchen table. Chairs scattered and dishes crashed to the floor as man and dog went down in a tangle of limbs and snapping jaws. Moses was fighting for his life, or at least fighting against another round of the abuse he'd learned to expect from human hands. His teeth caught Eli's forearm, tearing through shirt and skin with surgical precision. But Eli didn't fight back. Years of mining experience had taught him that sometimes the only way to survive a cave-in was to stop struggling and wait for the mountain to finish moving. The same principle applied here. Instead of trying to overpower Moses or defend himself, Eli went limp, covering his head and neck, while letting the dog exhaust his rage against an opponent who refused to become an enemy. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Moses bit and clawed and snarled his way through 15 years of accumulated fury, using Eli as a proxy for every human who had ever raised a hand against him. When the storm finally passed, both man and dog lay panting on the cabin floor, surrounded by the wreckage of Eli's morning routine. Moses was the first to move, scrambling away to put distance between himself and the human he'd just mauled. He pressed himself into the corner farthest from Eli, eyes wide with the expectation of retaliation that would probably cost him his life. Eli sat up slowly, taking inventory of his wounds. The bite on his forearm was deep but clean, the kind of injury he'd learned to treat during his mining days. Scratches on his chest and shoulders would heal on their own. His dignity had taken the worst beating, but that was a luxury he'd learned to live without. "Well," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I reckon we got that out of the way." Moses flinched at the sound of human speech, pressing himself deeper into the corner. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the panting of an animal that had just committed an act he knew would bring terrible consequences. But instead of reaching for the rifle that hung above his fireplace, Eli began cleaning up the scattered dishes and overturned furniture. He moved slowly and deliberately, making no sudden movements that might trigger another defensive attack. When he found an unbroken cup, he filled it with water and set it on the floor halfway between himself and the trembling dog. "Expect you worked up a thirst," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather with a neighbor. "Water's good here. Comes from a spring up the mountain, cold enough to hurt your teeth." Moses watched this incomprehensible human behavior with the confusion of a creature whose entire worldview had just been challenged. Humans who got bitten were supposed to retaliate with boots, clubs, or worse. They weren't supposed to offer water and casual conversation. Eli continued his cleanup, talking in the same calm tone he'd once used to reassure nervous miners before a dangerous shift. "Used to have a dog when I was a boy. Blue heeler named Jasper. Smart as a whip, but stubborn as a politician when he got an idea in his head. One time he got into it with a porcupine, came home looking like a pincushion. Took me 3 hours to pull all them quills out, and he tried to bite me the whole time. Wasn't personal, just scared and hurt." The dog's breathing began to slow, as Eli's voice continued its steady, unthreatening cadence. When Eli moved to the wash basin to clean his wounds, Moses tensed, but didn't flee. The scent of blood was strong in the small cabin, but the expected violence never came. Problem with folks, Eli continued, dabbing antiseptic on his torn arm, is they think everything's about them. Dog bites you, must be because he's mean. Horse throws you, must be because he's stubborn. Mountain falls on you. His voice caught for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. Must be because you didn't read the signs right. He finished bandaging his arm and turned to face Moses directly for the first time since the attack. The dog was still pressed against the wall, but his yellow eyes held curiosity now alongside the fear. Truth is, Eli said, settling into his chair with deliberate slowness, most creatures are just trying to survive the best way they know how. Can't fault a man for that. Can't fault a dog either. As if to test this radical proposition, Moses made his first tentative move toward the water cup. When Eli remained motionless, the dog crept forward and began to drink, never taking his eyes off the human who had just redefined the rules of engagement. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the mountain valley, Eli sat on his porch with Moses lying 20 feet away. The dog had spent the afternoon exploring the boundaries of this new arrangement, testing whether kindness was a trap or a genuine offer of sanctuary. The heavy chain that had bound him at Murphy's store lay coiled near the cabin door, not a symbol of captivity, but a reminder of how far they'd both traveled in a single day. For the first time in 15 years, Eli found himself responsible for something other than his own survival. The weight of that responsibility was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. Moses might never trust him completely, might always carry the scars of his brutal past, but something had changed in both of them during that morning's violent confrontation. As darkness settled over the mountain, Eli could hear Moses shifting position, moving closer to the cabin's warmth and protection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of this fragile alliance between two damaged souls who had found each other at the edge of the world. But tonight, for the first time in years, neither man nor dog would sleep entirely alone. The wooden bowl took Eli most of the morning to carve properly. He'd started the project as a simple matter of practicality. Moses needed something to eat that didn't remind him of the tin pans and broken dishes that had probably been part of his harsh upbringing. But as Eli worked the mountain ash wood with tools that had seen more use repairing mining equipment than crafting household items, he found himself paying attention to details that served no practical purpose. The curve of the bowl's interior followed his hand's natural motion, smooth and even. He carved a simple geometric pattern around the rim. Nothing fancy, just something that made the object feel intentional rather than thrown together. When he was finished, he ran his fingers over the surface, checking for rough spots that might irritate a dog's sensitive muzzle. It was the first thing he'd made for another living creature in 15 years. Moses watched the carving process from his preferred spot near the cabin's corner, those intelligent yellow eyes tracking every movement of Eli's hands. The dog had spent the past 3 days learning the rhythms of mountain life, discovering that this strange human followed predictable patterns that made survival easier to calculate. Morning meant the smell of coffee and bacon. Eli would sit on his porch, drink from his tin cup, and speak in that same calm voice he'd used after the attack. The words didn't matter as much as the tone, steady, unthreatening, patient. Afternoon meant work around the cabin, splitting wood, tending his small garden, maintaining the equipment that kept mountain life possible. Evening meant quiet time on the porch, watching sunset paint the peaks while the world settled into darkness. But it was during the wound-cleaning rituals that Moses began to understand something unprecedented was happening. Every morning and evening, Eli would clean the infected gashes on Moses's neck where the chain had worn away fur and flesh. The dog had growled the first time the human approached with a bowl of warm water and clean cloth, expecting pain. Instead, Eli's hands had been gentle but thorough, cleaning away the accumulated infection with the same careful attention he gave his own injuries. "Easy there," Eli would murmur during these sessions, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from experience with wounded creatures. "I know it stings, but infection's worse than medicine. Had a miner once, got a pick through his and refused to let the doc clean it proper. Lost the whole arm to gangrene." Moses didn't understand the words, but he understood the intention behind them. This human was trying to heal rather than harm, a concept so foreign to his experience that it took days for him to stop flinching at Eli's approach. The breakthrough came during the fourth morning's cleaning session, as Eli dabbed antiseptic on a particularly nasty wound behind Moses's left ear. The dog did something that surprised them both. He leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. It was a tiny gesture, barely perceptible, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. "Well now," Eli said softly, continuing his work with steady hands, "maybe we're getting somewhere after all." The progress was measured in small increments. Moses began following Eli at a distance during his daily routines, staying far enough away to run, but close enough to observe. When Eli split wood, Moses learned to position himself upwind of the flying chips. When Eli worked in his garden, Moses would settle where he could watch the cabin's approaches, not protecting his new companion so much as protecting his access to regular meals and medical care. But the afternoon when everything truly changed started with the scream of a mountain lion. Eli was checking his rabbit snares in the aspen grove, below the cabin, when the big cat's hunting cry echoed off the canyon walls. The sound was close, maybe 50 yards, and getting closer. Mountain lions didn't usually hunt during daylight hours unless something had disrupted their normal patterns: injury, extreme hunger, or territorial pressure from other predators. Moses appeared at Eli's side, as if materialized from the mountain air itself. The dog's transformation was instantaneous and complete. Gone was the cautious, wounded animal that had spent days learning to trust. In its place stood something primal and magnificent, hackles raised, teeth bared, positioning himself between Eli and the direction of the cat's cry. The lion emerged from the timber with the fluid grace of a creature designed by evolution for killing. A young male, probably driven from his mother's territory and struggling to establish his own hunting grounds. His golden coat was marred by fresh scratches, evidence of recent fights with other predators. When he saw the human and dog, he dropped into a hunting crouch, tail twitching with predatory calculation. For a moment, the three predators, man, dog, and cat, formed a triangle of potential violence in the dappled sunlight of the aspen grove. Eli's hand moved slowly toward the knife at his belt, knowing it would be inadequate against 150 pounds of teeth and claws. The mountain lion's muscles bunched for a spring that would cover the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. Moses attacked first. The dog's charge was a thing of terrible beauty, raw power channeled through perfect instinct. He hit the mountain lion low and hard, his massive jaws clamping down on the cat's shoulder before it could bring its claws into play. The two animals rolled through the underbrush in a snarling tangle of fur and fury, each fighting for the kind of advantage that would end the battle decisively. Eli drew his knife and moved to help, but Moses had already shifted position, driving the lion backward with a series of powerful rushes that showcased not just courage, but tactical intelligence. The dog was using his superior weight and jaw strength to negate the cat's natural advantages of speed and agility. The mountain lion, faced with an opponent that refused to show fear, made the practical decision that had kept his species alive for millennia. With a final snarl of frustrated rage, he broke away from the fight and disappeared into the timber as quickly as he'd emerged, leaving behind only the scent of wild musk and the memory of yellow eyes that promised future encounters. Moses stood panting in the sudden silence, his coat matted with blood that might have been his own, or the lion's. When he turned to look at Eli, there was something new in his expression. Not submission or even partnership, but a kind of fierce pride that said he'd made a choice, about who deserved his protection. "Well," Eli said, his voice rough with emotions. He'd forgotten he could feel. "I reckon that settles that." That evening, Moses slept inside the cabin for the first time, positioning himself near the door where he could guard against intruders while still maintaining an escape route. Eli lay in his narrow bed, listening to the dogs breathing and thinking about what it meant to have something depend on him again. Outside, the mountain wind carried the distant howl of coyotes and the rustle of night hunters beginning their ancient routines. But inside the cabin, two damaged souls had found something neither had expected, the beginning of trust, built not on sentiment or loneliness, but on the kind of mutual respect that only comes from facing danger together. As sleep finally claimed him, Eli found himself wondering if maybe Martha had been right all those years ago when she'd insisted that healing required more than just time and solitude. Maybe it required the courage to let something else matter again, even if it meant risking the kind of loss that had driven him to these mountains in the first place. The name came to Eli while watching the dog part a pack of aggressive coyotes, with nothing more than his presence and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. Moses, because, like the biblical figure, this scarred creature had somehow found the authority to divide hostile forces and lead the chosen to safety. It had been 2 weeks since the mountain lion encounter, and the dog's transformation continued to unfold in ways that surprised Eli daily. Moses had appointed himself guardian of their small domain, patrolling the perimeter each morning and evening with the methodical precision of a professional sentry. He'd learned to read Eli's intentions through subtle cues, the way the man held his shoulders when preparing for a hunting trip, the particular rhythm of his movements when he was planning to visit town for supplies. But it was during their first hunting expedition together that Eli truly understood the intelligence behind those yellow eyes. They'd been tracking a young buck through the high meadows above the cabin, Moses ranging ahead to scout, while Eli followed the game trail with the patience of a man who understood that hunger was a luxury the mountain didn't always accommodate. The deer had been feeding in a small clearing, unaware of the predators approaching from downwind. Moses had frozen at the edge of the tree line, one paw raised, head cocked at the precise angle that hunters recognize as the moment before decisive action. But instead of charging or barking, the dog had looked back at Eli with an expression of pure communication, asking permission, waiting for direction from the pack leader. When Eli raised his rifle and nodded, Moses had circled wide, driving the deer toward the clearing's narrow exit, where Eli waited with clear sight lines and steady hands. The shot had been clean, the deer dropping without suffering, and Moses had remained motionless until Eli approached to confirm the kill. "Good boy," Eli had said, the first words of praise he'd spoken to another living creature in 15 years. Moses's tail had moved in what might have been the beginning of a wag, quickly suppressed as if the dog wasn't quite ready to admit he cared about human approval. The meat had lasted them a week, properly smoked and stored according to methods Eli had learned from mountain men who'd made these peaks their home long before mining companies discovered copper in the rocks below. Moses had proven himself capable of patience during the preservation process, never begging or stealing, despite the constant presence of fresh meat. More importantly, he'd shown himself capable of sharing. When a pair of ravens had landed near, their smoking setup drawn by the scent of cooking venison, Moses had watched them with interest rather than aggression. When one of the bold birds had hopped close enough to snatch a small piece of gristle, the dog had simply shifted position to block access to the larger portions while allowing the ravens their small tribute. "Smart," Eli had observed, recognizing the wisdom of maintaining good relations with the mountain's other residents. Ravens remember kindness, and they remember grudges even longer. These evening conversations had become part of their routine. Eli would sit on his porch, Moses lying nearby, but always positioned to watch the approaches to their territory. The man would talk, sometimes about hunting techniques, sometimes about weather patterns, sometimes about memories he'd kept buried for years. "Had a wife once," he found himself saying one evening as autumn colors began painting the aspen groves in shades of gold and red. Martha, prettiest woman in 3 counties, could have had a pick of any man from Denver to Durango. For some reason, she picked me. Moses's ears twitched forward at the change in Eli's tone, the careful attention of a creature learning to read human emotions through vocal inflections. She loved animals, always bringing home strays, cats, dogs, even a baby owl one time that had fallen from its nest. Had gentle hands, could calm the wildest creature just by talking to it. Eli's voice grew softer, edged with the kind of pain that time softened but never fully healed. Used to say that everything deserved a second chance, that love was the only medicine that really worked for the deep wounds. The wooden drawer in Eli's bedside table hadn't been opened in 15 years, but that night he found his hands moving toward it with the inevitability of a man finally ready to face what he'd been avoiding. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that still held the faint scent of lavender, lay Martha's wedding ring. The simple gold band caught the lamplight as Eli turned it between his fingers, remembering the day he'd slipped it onto her hand in the little church in Leadville. She'd been 19, full of dreams about the life they'd build together in the mountains. He'd been 25, convinced that his understanding of rock and earth and the mountains' moods would be enough to keep her safe. Moses appeared in the bedroom doorway, drawn by some instinct that told him his companion was struggling with emotions too complex for words. The dog approached slowly, settling beside Eli's chair with the careful presence of a creature offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "She would have liked you," Eli said, his voice thick with memories he'd trained himself not to revisit. Would have seen past all them scars to whatever's underneath, had a gift for that. The next morning brought Dr. Sarah Chen up the mountain trail, her horse picking its way carefully over the rocky path that led to Eli's cabin. She'd never visited before, and her presence meant either medical emergency or news too important to wait for his next trip to town. Moses positioned himself between the approaching rider and Eli, hackles raised but not yet growling. The dog's body language suggested wariness rather than aggression, the stance of a guardian gathering information about potential threats. "Easy, Moses," Eli said, the name feeling natural on his tongue for the first time. "She's a friend." Dr. Chen dismounted 20 yards from the cabin, showing the kind of respect for territorial boundaries that spoke of experience with both wild animals and wild men. She was a small woman, barely reaching Eli's shoulder, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling situations where mistakes could cost lives. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that had marked their previous encounters. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have news that couldn't wait." Moses remained alert, but allowed her approach, reading Eli's calm demeanor as permission to tolerate this human's presence. When the dog's massive head turned to study her with those intelligent yellow eyes, Dr. Chen showed no fear, just the professional assessment of a medical practitioner evaluating a patient's condition. "That's quite a remarkable animal," she observed, noting the scars and the careful way Moses positioned himself for optimal defensive advantage. "He's had a rough time of it," Eli replied, "but he's finding his way." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. Sometimes the ones who've been hurt the worst make the most loyal companions. They understand the value of genuine kindness. Her news, when it came, would change everything. Reports of the Dalton gang moving through the territory, leaving a trail of robbed banks and murdered lawmen in their wake. But in that moment, watching Moses cautiously accept the presence of another human in their sanctuary, Eli found himself thinking about Martha's theories on healing and second chances. Maybe the mountain had brought him exactly what he needed. even if it had taken 15 years for him to be ready to receive it. The news that Dr. Chen brought up the mountain trail hit Eli like a cave-in he should have seen coming. The Dalton gang, 5 men with a reputation for violence that made experienced lawmen cross themselves and lock their doors after dark, had robbed the First National Bank in Silverton 3 days ago, killing 2 tellers and a customer who'd tried to play hero. They were moving east through the high country, following routes that would bring them dangerously close to Cedar Falls. Sheriff Hawkins received a telegram this morning, Dr. Chen explained, accepting the cup of coffee Eli offered, while maintaining the careful distance that Moses's watchful presence demanded. The gang's been using mountain passes to avoid the main roads. They know this territory. Eli spread his old mining map across the cabin's wooden table, the paper yellowed with age but still accurate in every detail that mattered. His fingers traced the network of trails and abandoned mine shafts that crisscrossed the high country like a spider's web, each line representing knowledge gained through years of hard experience in these unforgiving peaks. "These here are the main passes," he said, pointing to the obvious routes that connected the mining camps and settlements. "But if they're smart, and word is they are, they'll be using the old prospector trails. Harder going, but you can move, unseen for days at a time." Moses had positioned himself where he could observe both humans while maintaining clear sightlines to the cabin's exits. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly protective since Dr. Chen's arrival, not from aggression, but from what Eli was beginning to recognize as a sophisticated understanding of pack dynamics. The doctor represented a potential complication to the simple life they'd been building together. "How do you know so much about their movements?" Dr. Chen asked, studying the intricate detail of Eli's hand-drawn map. The question brought back memories that Eli had spent 15 years trying to bury. "Used to be my job to know every inch of this country. Mining foreman has to understand the landscape like his own backyard, where the rock's solid, where it's not, which routes will get you out fast if things go wrong." He didn't mention that his expertise had failed when it mattered most, that all his knowledge of the mountain's moods hadn't been enough to save the people he'd loved. Some wounds were too deep to share with relative strangers, even ones offering medical care and genuine concern. "The thing about these passes," Eli continued, forcing his mind back to the present danger, "is they're like a funnel, lots of ways, in but only a few ways out. Man who knows the country could bottle up a whole army if he positioned himself right." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her medical training giving way to something that looked remarkably like tactical thinking. "Are you suggesting we could trap them?" "I'm suggesting that running blind into the deep mountains might not be the smartest move for folks who've never spent a winter above the tree line." Eli's voice carried the authority of experience. "Gang like that, they're probably planning to hit Cedar Falls for supplies before moving on. Small town, no real law enforcement, easy pickings." The assessment stung because it was accurate. Sheriff Hawkins had bought his badge rather than earning it, and the town's residents were mostly miners, storekeepers, and their families. Decent people, but not fighters. If the Dalton gang decided Cedar Falls looked like easy prey, it would be a massacre. Moses rose and moved to the window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles were raised, and he was staring intently at something beyond the cabin's walls. Both humans froze, recognizing the dog's behavior as a warning worth heeding. "Company coming," Eli said, reaching for the rifle that hung above his fireplace. "Moses doesn't make noise unless there's good reason." The sound of approaching horses reached them a moment later, multiple riders moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Dr. Chen moved away from the window while Eli checked his weapon's load, both of them understanding that unexpected visitors in this remote location rarely brought good news. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from the tree line, leading a small group of townsmen, their faces grim with the kind of fear that made ordinary people do extraordinary things. Behind him rode Murphy from the general store, the town's blacksmith, and 2 others Eli recognized but couldn't name. "Boone," Hawkins called out as he dismounted. "Need to talk to you." Moses's growling intensified, his body language screaming warnings that Eli was only beginning to learn to read. The dog had positioned himself between the approaching men and Dr. Chen, as if he'd identified her as the more vulnerable member of their pack and acted accordingly. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, but he kept his rifle ready. Moses's instincts about people had proven remarkably accurate during their short partnership. "Dalton Gang hit Fairplay yesterday," Hawkins announced without preamble. "Killed 3 people, including a woman and her child. They're heading this way, probably be here within 2 days." Murphy stepped forward, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by desperate determination. "We need your help, Eli. You know these mountains better than any man alive. Help us figure out how to protect the town." Eli studied the faces of the men who'd made the hard ride up to his sanctuary. These weren't professional soldiers or experienced fighters. They were shopkeepers and laborers who'd never fired a shot in anger. But they were willing to die defending their homes and families, which counted for something in the mountains' harsh arithmetic of survival. "What about the territorial marshal?" Eli asked. "Or the army garrison at Fort Collins?" "Too far away," Hawkins replied, and something in his voice made Moses's growling increase in intensity. "Takes 3 days minimum to get word to them, another 3 for them to organize a response. We'll all be dead by then." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her medical bag in one hand, and her chin raised with stubborn courage. "I've seen what the Dalton Gang does to the places they raid. If we don't stop them here, they'll kill everyone in Cedar Falls and move on to the next town. Someone has to make a stand." Eli looked at his map again, seeing not just topographical features but possibilities, choke points where a small force could hold off a larger one, escape routes that led through terrain too dangerous for pursued bandits to follow, positions where a man with Moses's intelligence and loyalty could make the difference between victory and massacre. 15 years of self-imposed exile had taught him that running from responsibility was easier than facing it, but it had also taught him that some things were worth the risk of loss. The people of Cedar Falls weren't his family, but they were trying to protect their families, and that meant something to a man who'd failed to protect his own. "Moses," he said quietly, and the dog's head turned toward him with complete attention. "What do you think, boy? Ready to see what we're really made of?" The dog's tail moved in what might have been the beginning of a wag, and Eli found himself making a decision that would have been impossible a month ago. Sometimes healing meant more than just surviving. Sometimes it meant finding the courage to care about something again, even if it meant risking the peace he'd fought so hard to achieve. The decision to help Cedar Falls came with conditions that Sheriff Hawkins didn't like but couldn't afford to refuse. Eli would scout the gang's approach routes and set up defensive positions, but he'd do it his way, using guerrilla tactics learned from mountain men who'd fought Apache and survived winters that killed lesser souls. No direct confrontations, no heroic last stands that looked good in dime novels, but got good men killed in real life. We hit them where they're vulnerable and disappear before they can hit back," Eli explained to the assembled townsmen. "Make them think the mountains themselves are fighting against them." Moses had appointed himself as Eli's second-in-command during these planning sessions, positioning himself where he could observe every person present while staying close enough to his partner to provide immediate support. The dog's presence added an element of unpredictability that made even the familiar townsmen nervous, which was exactly what Eli wanted. "Your dog going to be part of this?" Murphy asked, eyeing Moses with the respect that large predators demanded. "Moses goes where I go," Eli replied. "He's got better instincts about people than most folks I've met." The truth of that statement was becoming clearer every day. During the past week of preparation, Moses had demonstrated an uncanny ability to read human intentions and motivations that went far beyond simple animal instinct. When Dr. Chen visited to discuss medical preparations for the coming confrontation, Moses remained calm and alert. When Sheriff Hawkins approached the cabin, The dog's hackles rose, and his posture shifted to something approaching aggressive warning. Eli had begun to trust Moses's judgment about people more than his own. The training sessions took place in the high meadows above Cedar Falls, where Eli could teach basic tactical principles without revealing the specific positions he planned to use against the gang. Moses proved to be an invaluable assistant during these lessons, demonstrating concepts that were difficult to explain with words alone. Communication in a fight is everything, Eli told the nervous townsman. You lose contact with your partners. You lose the advantage of numbers. He whistled softly, a sound barely audible above the mountain wind. Moses immediately moved to a position 30 yards away, circling behind the group of men, with the silent efficiency of a natural hunter. A second whistle brought the dog back to Eli's side, having completed a maneuver that showcased both obedience and tactical intelligence. Moses and I worked out signals for different situations, Eli explained. Simple sounds that don't carry far, but get the message across. You men need to do the same thing. Murphy raised his hand like a schoolboy asking, permission to speak. How'd you train him to do that so fast? Dog's only been with you a few weeks. Eli looked at Moses, seeing not just the scarred rescue animal he'd bought for a quarter, but a partner whose loyalty had been earned through patience and mutual respect. Didn't train him so much as learn to work with him. Moses was smart before I came along. He just needed someone who wouldn't punish him for being what he is. The conversations with Moses had evolved into something approaching genuine communication. Not the anthropomorphic fantasy of a lonely man projecting human thoughts onto an animal, but the kind of practical partnership that developed between creatures who'd learned to trust each other's instincts. Gang like this, they'll scout their target before moving in, Eli explained to Moses during one of their evening planning sessions. They'll send 1 or 2 men ahead to check for resistance, escape routes, anything that might complicate their robbery. Moses listened with the focused attention he gave to all of Eli's explanations, as if he understood not just the tone, but the content of these strategic discussions. When Eli spread his mining map on the cabin table, the dog would position himself where he could see both the paper and the approaches to their sanctuary. Problem is, Eli continued, running his finger along the trails that led to Cedar Falls. They know we're here now. Hawkins and his boys visiting like that, it announced our involvement to anyone watching the town. They'll be expecting some kind of resistance. The signal mirror had belonged to Martha, a small compact that she'd carried in her purse during their brief marriage. Eli had found it among her things after the mining accident, had kept it in the drawer with her wedding ring as a reminder of dreams that had died under tons of fallen rock. Now he held it up to catch the afternoon sunlight, sending coded flashes to predetermined positions where townsmen waited to relay messages. Simple signals, 1 flash for all clear, 3 flashes for trouble coming, continuous flashing for immediate danger. The system would allow him and Moses to coordinate with the town's defenders without using runners who might be intercepted or voices that might carry to enemy ears. You understand what we're getting into? He asked Moses as they prepared for another scouting expedition. These aren't mountain lions or coyotes we're dealing with. These are men who kill for profit, and they won't hesitate to put a bullet in either one of us. Moses's response was to move closer to Eli's side, not in submission but in solidarity. The dog had made his choice about where his loyalty lay, and no amount of danger would change that fundamental decision. Dr. Chen arrived that evening with news that confirmed Eli's worst fears. I treated a wounded prospector this afternoon, she reported. He'd been shot trying to protect his claim up near Willow Creek, described 5 men, heavily armed, asking questions about the best routes to Cedar Falls. She'd also brought something else, a small medical kit specifically assembled for treating gunshot wounds under field conditions. I know you're planning to avoid direct confrontation, she said, but bullets don't always respect good intentions. When she handed Eli the medical supplies, their fingers touched briefly, and he found himself remembering what it felt like to have someone care about his welfare. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying. Caring about people meant risking, the kind of loss that had driven him to these mountains in the first place. Moses watched this interaction with the careful attention he gave to all developments that might affect their partnership. When Dr. Chen knelt to examine a small cut on the dog's paw, Moses allowed the contact without growling, apparently deciding that anyone who concerned herself with his welfare deserved at least provisional trust. "He's remarkable," she observed, noting the careful way Moses positioned himself to protect both humans while accepting her medical attention. "I've never seen an animal with this level of tactical awareness." "He's been through things that would break most creatures," Eli replied. "But instead of breaking, he got stronger and smarter. Sometimes the worst experiences teach the most valuable lessons." As Dr. Chen prepared to return to town, Eli found himself wanting to say something more, to acknowledge the courage it took for her to involve herself in a fight that wasn't really hers. But the words felt too heavy with implications he wasn't ready to explore. Instead, he simply said, "Be careful down there. If shooting starts before we're ready, get yourself and as many others as possible to the old mine shaft behind the church. Moses and I marked it yesterday. It's got 3 separate exits and enough supplies to last a week." She nodded, understanding that this was as close to a declaration of caring as a man like Eli could manage. As she rode back down the mountain trail, both man and dog watched until she disappeared into the gathering darkness, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy expression. Tomorrow would bring the Dalton gang within striking distance of Cedar Falls, and everything they'd built together would be tested by fire and lead, and the kind of violence that changed people forever. But tonight, for the last time in what might be a very long while, they could sit on their porch and listen to the mountain's peaceful silence. 2 damaged souls who'd found something worth fighting for. The attack came 2 hours before dawn, when the mountain air was sharp enough to cut, and the darkness still held the kind of weight that made men question their courage. Eli and Moses had been watching the approach trail since midnight, positioned in a rocky outcropping that offered clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. The plan was simple: observe the gang's movements, identify their strengths and weaknesses, then fade back into the mountains to prepare defensive positions around Cedar Falls. What they discovered instead changed everything. Moses smelled them first, his nose twitching at scents that didn't belong in the high country at this hour. 5 riders moving with the careful precision of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find there. But they weren't heading toward Cedar Falls as anticipated. They were climbing directly toward Eli's mountain sanctuary, following a route that should have been known only to someone intimately familiar with these particular peaks and valleys. "How do they know about the cabin?" Eli whispered, more to himself than to Moses, but the dog's low growl suggested he'd identified something in the approaching riders that triggered every instinct he'd developed about dangerous humans. The answer came with the dawn light. When Sheriff Hawkins rode into the clearing below Eli's cabin at the head of the Dalton gang, his badge glinting in the early sunlight like a piece of fool's gold. The conversation that followed carried clearly in the thin mountain air, revealing a conspiracy that made Eli's stomach clench with familiar rage. "This is the place," Hawkins was saying, dismounting near the spot where Moses had once been chained. "Boone's got maps of every mine shaft and hidden trail in 3 counties. You eliminate him, you control the high country." Black Jack Dalton, the gang's leader, was a lean man with the kind of pale eyes that suggested violence was a tool he used without conscience or regret. "And the town will roll over like a whipped dog once they know their mountain man savior is dead," Hawkins replied. "I've been feeding them information about your movements, making sure they'd ask Boone for help. Now that he's committed to defending them, all we have to do is remove him from the equation." Moses was vibrating with barely controlled fury, his hackles raised and teeth bared in a silent snarl that promised terrible retribution for anyone who threatened his pack leader. Eli had to place a restraining hand on the dog's shoulder to prevent, him from launching an attack that would get them both killed. The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. The rescue mission had been a setup from the beginning, designed to draw him out of his secure mountain position and into a trap where his knowledge and tactical skills could be neutralized. Sheriff Hawkins had been playing both sides, feeding information to the gang while appearing to organize the town's defense. Problem is, Blackjack continued, studying the cabin through a spyglass. Boone's not here. Place looks empty. He'll be back, Hawkins said with confidence. Man like that doesn't abandon a fight once he's committed to it. We wait here, we control the high ground when he returns. Eli found himself faced with a tactical nightmare. The gang had occupied his cabin, the center of his planned defensive network. All his supplies, his detailed maps, his carefully prepared fallback positions, everything was now in enemy hands. Worse, they knew he was committed to defending Cedar Falls, which meant they could use the town's residents as bait to draw him. Into the open, Moses pressed against Eli's side, offering the kind of solid comfort that came from a partner who understood that sometimes the world revealed itself to be more cruel and complicated than anyone had hoped. The dog's loyalty was absolute, but loyalty alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the disadvantages they now faced. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced another complication. Dr. Chen rode into the clearing on her medical rounds, unaware that she was delivering herself directly into the hands of the men she'd been helping to plan against. Her medical bag marked her as someone with value to the townspeople, making her a perfect hostage for controlling the situation. Well now, Blackjack said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man whose plans were falling into place. Looks like our wait just got shorter. The capture was efficient and brutal. Dr. Chen was dragged from her horse before she could react, her medical bag scattered across the ground as rough hands bound her arms behind her back. When she tried to call out, whether to warn Eli or simply to express her defiance, a backhanded blow from one of the gang members silenced her with the casual violence that marked these men as killers rather than mere thieves. Moses lunged forward, before Eli could stop him, driven by protective instincts that overrode tactical caution. The dog's massive frame crashed through the underbrush as he charged toward the clearing, intent on defending the human who'd shown kindness to his pack leader. "Moses! No!" Eli shouted. But it was too late. The ambush was perfectly coordinated. 3 rifles fired simultaneously, their bullets designed not to kill the charging dog, but to wound him severely enough to end his threat while keeping him alive as leverage. Moses tumbled across the rocky ground, his left rear leg shattered by a rifle bullet, blood streaming from a graze along his ribs. The dog's howl of pain and rage echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of something wild and magnificent being. Destroyed by civilized cruelty, he tried to rise to continue his charge despite his wounds, but the damage was too severe. Moses collapsed near the base of a pine tree, yellow eyes still burning with fury even as his body failed him. "There's your mountain man," Hawkins called out, knowing that Eli would reveal himself rather than watch his companions suffer. "Come on down, Boone, or we start cutting pieces off your friends." Eli emerged from his concealment with his hands raised, rifle left behind in the rocks above. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving Moses time to process what was happening and understand that this surrender was tactical rather than defeat. The dog's intelligence had saved them before. Now Eli was counting on it to save them again. "Smart man," Blackjack observed as Eli approached the clearing. "Though I hear you weren't always so practical about protecting the people you care about." The reference to Martha and Tommy hit like a physical blow, confirming that Hawkins had shared not just tactical information, but personal details about Eli's past. The sheriff's betrayal was complete, encompassing not just military intelligence, but the intimate knowledge of loss that made psychological warfare possible. Moses was trying to crawl toward Eli despite his injuries, driven by loyalty that wouldn't acknowledge the reality of his physical limitations. Blood was pooling beneath the dog's body, and his breathing had the shallow, rapid rhythm that suggested shock was setting in. "Leave him be," Eli said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man who'd learned to channel rage into focused purpose. "Your fight's with me." "Actually," Blackjack replied, drawing his sidearm with the casual ease of frequent practice, "our fight's with anyone who might interfere with our business in these mountains. But don't worry, we'll make it. Quick for both of you." The click of the hammer being pulled back seemed to echo forever in the mountain silence, a sound that marked the end of one story and the beginning of something darker and more desperate. But as Blackjack raised his weapon, Moses's yellow eyes met Eli's across the blood-stained clearing, and in that moment of connection, both man and dog understood that surrender didn't have to mean defeat. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or tactics, but with the kind of stubborn loyalty that refused to acknowledge when the odds had become impossible. Sometimes healing came not from avoiding conflict, but from finding something worth fighting for, even when fighting meant risking everything you'd learned to value. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and stone and blood, and in that mixture, both predator and prey recognized the smell of a hunt that was far from over. The abandoned mine shaft that became their prison had been carved into the mountain's heart by men who died believing copper was worth more than their lives. Now it served as a tomb for different dreams, its walls weeping mineral-stained water that caught the light from Blackjack's lantern like tears on granite cheeks. Moses lay in the corner farthest from their captors, his breathing shallow but steady. The dog's yellow eyes tracked every movement in the cramped space, calculating distances and possibilities, despite the pain that must have been coursing through his wounded body. 3 times during the past hour, he'd tried to rise and position himself between the gang members and his human companions, only to collapse as his shattered leg failed to support his weight. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used during Moses's medical treatments at the cabin. "Save your strength. We're going to need it." Dr. Chen sat against the opposite wall, her hands bound, but her eyes alert as she studied Moses's wounds with professional assessment. "His leg needs attention," she whispered to Eli when the gang members moved deeper into the mine to discuss their plans. The bleeding stopped, but infection could set in quickly in these conditions. "He's tougher than he looks," Eli replied, though his own assessment of Moses's condition was equally grim. The dog had lost blood, was showing signs of shock, and was trapped in an environment that offered no opportunities for the kind of movement that had always been his greatest advantage. But Moses was also demonstrating something that impressed even their captors, an absolutely unshakable loyalty that refused to acknowledge defeat. Despite his injuries, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the dog continued to position himself as protector and guardian, watching for opportunities to defend his pack, even when logic suggested that resistance was futile. Hawkins appeared. At the mine entrance, his sheriff's badge now seeming like a piece of costume jewelry, worn by an actor playing a role he'd never earned the right to perform. "Gang's decided what to do with you folks," he announced. "Boone, they want your maps and your knowledge of the local mine systems. Give them what they need, and they'll make your deaths quick." "And if I refuse?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we start with your friends and make you watch." Hawkins' voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Blackjack's got creative ideas about persuasion. From deeper in the mine came the sound of the gang members exploring the tunnel system, their voices echoing off stone walls as they discovered the complexity of the underground network. This particular mine connected to at least 3 others, through a web of natural caves and man-made passages that Eli had explored during his years as a foreman. The gang was smart enough to recognize that controlling these tunnels would give them invisible highways through the heart of the mountain country, but they didn't know what Eli knew about the mine's history. 15 years ago, this had been one of the most productive copper mines in the territory. It had also been one of the most dangerous, prone to cave-ins and gas accumulations that made every shift a gamble with death. The final closure had come after a series of structural failures that made continued operation impossible. Failures that Eli had documented in reports that gathered dust in mining company offices. More importantly, the mine still contained explosive charges that had been abandoned when the operation shut down. Unstable dynamite that had been deemed too dangerous to remove, sealed behind barriers that were designed to contain potential blasts. The mining company had simply written off the losses and moved on to safer investments. Moses raised his head, as if sensing his companion's thoughts, yellow eyes focusing on Eli's face with the kind of communication that had developed between them during their weeks of partnership. The dog understood that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't grasp the specific details of what Eli was planning. In the deepest pocket of his jacket, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it for 15 years, lay Martha's final letter. Eli had carried it through every supply run to town, every hunting expedition, every lonely evening when the mountain silence threatened to drive him mad with grief. He'd never found the courage to open it, terrified that her final words might contain recriminations about his failure to protect their family. Now, with death approaching and Moses bleeding in a prison that smelled of fear and old copper, Eli finally broke the seal. Martha's handwriting was as beautiful as he remembered, each letter formed with the careful precision she'd learned in the school where she'd taught before their marriage. The words themselves were a revelation that hit him harder than any physical blow. My dearest Eli, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're blaming yourself for something that was never your fault. The mountain gives and takes according to laws that no human understanding can predict or prevent. I need you to know that our love was the greatest gift of my life, and Tommy's too. Don't let grief make you forget that healing comes not from avoiding love, but from having the courage to love again. Find someone to protect, something to nurture, some way to honor what we built together. The mountain needs guardians like you, people who understand that strength means protecting the vulnerable, not retreating from them. Live fully, my darling. Live for both of us. The letter was dated the morning of the mine collapse, written during what she'd expected to be an ordinary day that would end with them sharing dinner and planning their future. She'd had no way of knowing that her words would become a final testament, guidance from beyond the grave for a man who'd spent 15 years learning the wrong lessons from tragedy. Moses struggled to rise again, driven by instincts that refused to acknowledge his physical limitations. This time, Eli moved to support the dog's efforts, helping him achieve a sitting position that allowed him to maintain his self-appointed role as guardian, despite his wounds. "That's it, boy," Eli whispered, his voice rough with emotions too complex for easy expression. "We're not done yet." Dr. Chen had been watching this interaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that human and animal psychology often revealed themselves most clearly under extreme stress. "He's remarkable," she said quietly. "Most animals would have given up by now. Moses doesn't know how to give up," Eli replied. "Neither do I, apparently." The sound of approaching footsteps announced Blackjack's return from his exploration of the mine's depths. The gang leader's expression was satisfied, telling Eli that the criminals had discovered enough of the tunnel system to understand its potential value for their operations. "Impressive setup," Blackjack said, settling onto a wooden crate that had once contained mining equipment. These tunnels connect to at least 3 other mine sites, plus natural caves that lead clear through to the next valley. A man could move an army through here without being seen, or hide enough stolen gold to retire in comfort, Eli observed. Exactly. Blackjack's smile was the expression of a predator who'd found the perfect hunting ground. "Which is why we need your expertise to map the full system. Hawkins tells me you've got 15 years of knowledge about every tunnel and cave in this mountain." Knowledge like that has value, Eli said carefully. What are you offering in exchange? Your lives, for starters. Plus the satisfaction of knowing you helped establish a profitable business relationship that could benefit everyone involved. Moses's growl was barely audible, but it carried the kind of menace that made even hardened criminals pause. The dog was communicating something that went beyond simple animal aggression, a promise that death might claim him, but it wouldn't claim him quietly or without exacting a terrible price from his enemies. Here's what's going to happen, Eli said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd made peace with whatever came next. I'll give you the information you want, but I do it my way, and the dog and the doctor come with me while I show you around. Blackjack laughed, but there was something uneasy in the sound. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Actually, I am. Eli's smile was the expression of a man who'd finally understood what Martha had been trying to tell him in her letter. Because without my knowledge, these tunnels are just holes in the ground. With it, they're the key to controlling the entire territory. The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize a good deal when you see one. Moses pressed against Eli's leg, offering support while positioning himself to spring into action despite his injuries. The dog had made his choice about how this story would end, and that choice involved protecting his pack leader regardless of the personal cost. As darkness fell over the mountain, 3 wounded souls prepared to discover whether 15 years of healing and 4 weeks of partnership had been enough to forge the kind of bond that could survive the ultimate test. The mountain had taken everything from Eli once before, but this time he wasn't facing the darkness alone. This time he had Moses, and he had Martha's wisdom, and he had Dr. Chen's courage. Most importantly, he had finally learned the difference between running from love and running toward it, between surviving and living, between accepting loss and choosing hope. The abandoned mine shaft that had become their prison might also become their salvation, if they could find the courage to trust each other completely and fight for something larger than their individual survival. The old miner's lantern cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls as Eli led the gang deeper into the mountain's bowels. Moses limping beside him with stubborn determination that impressed even their captors. The dog's injured leg couldn't support his full weight, but he'd adapted his gait to maintain mobility while staying close enough to his pack leader to provide protection if opportunities arose. Dr. Chen followed behind them, her medical training evident in the way she monitored Moses's condition while appearing to focus on the geological formations around them. She'd positioned herself where she could signal Eli if the dog's injuries became life-threatening, their shared concern for Moses creating a communication system that their captors couldn't interpret. These main tunnels connect to the old Jefferson. Mine about 2 miles east, Eli explained, his carbide lamp illuminating passages that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of any light. Natural caves link the whole system together. You could move from here to the Colorado River without ever seeing daylight. Blackjack absorbed this information with the calculating attention of a man who understood that geographic advantages could be worth more than gold. How many people know about these connections? Used to be dozens, Eli replied, but most of the old miners are dead or moved on. Maybe 3 or 4 men left who remember the full layout. What he didn't mention was that he was the only one who remembered the location of the abandoned explosive charges or the structural weaknesses that made certain sections of the mine system dangerously unstable. Knowledge that could turn these tunnels from sanctuary into tomb, with the right application of force in the right locations. Moses paused at a junction where 3 passages converged, his nose twitching at scents that spoke of air currents and hidden spaces beyond the reach of lamplight. The dog's behavior had become increasingly alert as they moved deeper into the mine, suggesting he was detecting something that the humans had missed. "What's down that passage?" Blackjack asked, noting Moses's interest in a tunnel that branched. "Off to the north. Storage area," Eli said truthfully. where they kept equipment too valuable to leave topside between shifts. He didn't mention that the storage area also contained the mine's emergency arsenal, black powder, detonating caps, and fuses that had been sealed in waterproof containers to prevent accidents. Equipment that a knowledgeable man could use to bring down strategic sections of tunnel while creating escape routes for people who knew the mine's hidden exits. The first gang member they eliminated never knew what hit him. Moses had detected the man's presence in a side passage before anyone else realized they weren't alone. The dog's ears had pricked forward in the particular way that meant he'd identified a specific threat requiring immediate attention. When Eli whistled softly, a sound that carried barely 10 feet in the mine's acoustic maze, Moses understood. That permission had been granted for whatever action he deemed necessary. The attack was silent and efficient. Despite his injured leg, Moses moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of a predator who'd learned to compensate for physical limitations through superior tactics. The gang member had time for one startled grunt before Moses's jaws clamped around his throat, applying pressure that cut off both breath and the ability to call for help. Eli arrived moments later to finish what Moses had started, using his mining knife to ensure the threat was permanently neutralized. Dr. Chen helped them drag the body into a side chamber where it wouldn't be immediately discovered, her medical training making her surprisingly practical about the necessities of survival. "One down," Eli murmured to Moses, checking the dog's injuries to ensure the effort hadn't reopened his wounds. 4 to go. The second elimination came 30 minutes later, when another gang member separated from the group to investigate a side tunnel that Eli had mentioned contained valuable mining equipment. This time, Moses served as a silent scout, while Eli used his superior knowledge of the mine's layout to approach from an unexpected angle. The man died quickly, a mining pick through the heart, delivering the kind of instant death that mining accidents had made familiar to anyone who'd worked these tunnels during their operational years. His rifle and ammunition joined the growing arsenal that Eli was accumulating for the final confrontation. Moses had proven invaluable during these eliminations, his keen senses providing early warning, while his tactical intelligence helped coordinate attacks that left no evidence of human intervention. To the remaining gang members, it would appear that the mountain itself was claiming their companions, men simply vanishing into the darkness as if swallowed by the mine's hungry depths. 3 left, Dr. Chen whispered as they regrouped in a natural cave that connected to the main tunnel system, including Black Jack and Hawkins. "The dangerous ones?" Eli replied, cleaning his mining tools with the methodical care of a man who understood that equipment failure in hostile territory meant death. But also, the ones who think they're too smart to be outmaneuvered by a broken-down mountain man and a wounded dog. Moses settled beside them, his yellow eyes reflecting the lantern light as he monitored the tunnel entrances with unwavering attention. The dog's breathing had improved during their underground hunt, suggesting that activity was actually helping him cope with his injuries rather than aggravating them. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountain peaks, but in the mine's eternal darkness, time had become irrelevant. What mattered now was completing their deadly game of hide-and-seek before Blackjack realized that his superior numbers were being systematically eliminated by opponents who understood this underground battlefield better than any living men. Final confrontation took place in the mine's largest chamber, a cathedral-sized excavation where copper veins had once run so rich that men had died fighting over claims to work them. Natural acoustics turned every whisper into an echo, every footstep into a percussion that announced movement to anyone with ears to hear. Black Jack had realized his men were disappearing faster than cave-ins could explain. When he called out for the third missing gang member and received only silence, his pale eyes had taken on the calculating wariness of a predator who'd discovered he might actually be prey. "Enough games, Boone!" His voice boomed through the chamber, carrying the edge of a man whose confidence was being eroded by circumstances beyond his control. "I know you're out there. Bring the doctor and surrender, or I start shooting hostages." The problem with his threat was that he only had one hostage left, and Moses was hardly the kind of captive who would remain passive while his pack leader negotiated for his life. Eli emerged from the shadows with his hands raised, Dr. Chen beside him carrying the medical bag that had become their shared symbol of healing and hope. But Moses was nowhere to be seen, having vanished into the mines. Maze of side passages with the silent efficiency of a ghost seeking revenge. "Smart choice," Blackjack said, his rifle trained on Eli's chest. "Though I notice your dog seems to have developed ideas about heroics." "Moses makes his own decisions," Eli replied calmly. "Always has." Sheriff Hawkins appeared from behind a support timber, his gun drawn, but his hands shaking with the nervous energy of a man who'd discovered that betrayal carried consequences he hadn't anticipated. "Where are my men?" he demanded. "Jenkins and Martinez were supposed to check in an hour ago." "Mining accidents happen," Eli said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd seen too many good men claimed by unstable rock and bad luck. "Mountains don't care about your schedule." The explosion of black powder that announced Moses' presence shook dust from the chamber's ceiling and collapsed one of the main escape tunnels in a roar of falling stone that echoed like thunder through the mines. Depths. The dog had somehow found the abandoned demolition supplies and figured out how to use them. Not to kill, but to trap his enemies in a confined space where his pack leader's superior knowledge would provide decisive advantage. What the hell? Hawkins spun toward the sound of the explosion, giving Dr. Chen the opening she needed to dive behind a pile of mining equipment while Eli rolled in the opposite direction. Moses emerged from a side passage like an avenging spirit, his injured leg barely slowing his charge as he launched himself at Blackjack with the accumulated fury of every abuse he'd suffered at human hands. The dog's massive jaws clamped around. The gang leader's gun arm, his weight and momentum carrying both of them to the chamber floor in a tangle of snapping teeth and desperate curses. Eli was moving before Blackjack hit the ground, his mining experience giving him the kind of reflexes that turned unexpected moments into tactical advantages. Hawkins tried to bring his weapon to bear, but 15 years of mountain living had left Eli with muscles like cable and reflexes honed by daily survival challenges. The corrupt sheriff's shot went wide, sparking off stone walls as Eli's shoulder drove into his midsection with the force of a minecart hitting loose gravel. They crashed into the chamber wall hard enough to knock the wind from Hawkins's lungs and send his pistol skittering across the rocky floor. Moses and Blackjack were locked in a death struggle that showcased both the dog's incredible determination and the gang leader's vicious survival instincts. Despite his wounds, Moses had achieved a position that neutralized Blackjack's gun, while his powerful jaws maintained crushing pressure on the man's arm. But Blackjack had produced a knife with his free hand and was working to find an angle that would end the fight permanently. Dr. Chen appeared with Hawkins's dropped pistol, her medical training having taught her to remain calm under pressure that would paralyze civilians. "Enough!" she shouted, the weapon steady in her practiced hands. But it was the sound of Eli's voice that finally ended the violence. "Moses, easy boy, we got them." The dog maintained his grip on Blackjack's arm, but stopped trying to crush bone. Yellow, eyes fixed on his pack leader's face for confirmation that the immediate threat had been neutralized. When Eli nodded, Moses released his hold and limped back to position himself between the captured criminals and Dr. Chen. "Detonator handles connected to charges throughout the mine," Eli said conversationally, producing the old mining device he'd retrieved from the equipment storage. "One wrong move from either of you, and this whole section comes down. Might survive it myself, knowing the safe passages. Probably won't bother trying." The weight of absolute defeat settled over Black. Jack and Hawkins like avalanche snow, cold, heavy, and final. They'd been outmaneuvered by a broken-down mountain man, a wounded rescue dog, and a small-town doctor who'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones who fought for something larger than personal gain. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and freedom, but in the chamber's artificial twilight, justice was being measured in terms that had nothing to do with law books and everything to do with the kind of reckoning that came when predators finally met their match. 3 months after the Dalton gang's final robbery, Eli Boone sat on his cabin porch watching Moses train a litter of puppies in the fundamentals of mountain survival. The big dog's leg had healed with only a slight limp that seemed to add dignity rather than disability to his already impressive presence. More importantly, his capacity for trust had expanded to include not just Eli and Dr. Chen, but the entire community of Cedar Falls and the steady stream of visitors who made the pilgrimage up the mountain trail to meet the legendary pair. The new collar around Moses's neck was crafted from leather that Eli had worked during the long winter evenings, engraved with both their names in letters deep enough to last a lifetime. It wasn't a symbol of ownership, but of partnership. 2 names joined together because their separate stories had become one shared narrative of healing and redemption. Dr. Sarah Chen had become a permanent fixture in their mountain sanctuary, though she maintained her medical practice in Cedar Falls and the cabin she'd built halfway between town and Eli's remote homestead. The compromise suited all 3 of them, close enough for regular companionship, far enough apart to preserve the independence that mountain living demanded. Their romance had developed with the patient deliberation of people who understood that the best relationships were built on friendship and mutual respect rather than desperate loneliness or dramatic passion. They were both damaged souls who'd found healing in each other's company, but neither had forgotten that love meant accepting someone completely rather than trying to fix their broken places. Moses is teaching them to read the wind, Sarah observed, settling into the second rocking chair that Eli had carved during the previous winter. Look how he positions himself upwind before demonstrating tracking techniques. The puppies, 3 males and 2 females sired by Moses with Belle, Murphy's gentle retriever, were displaying the same intelligence and tactical awareness that had made their father such an exceptional companion. At 10 weeks old, they could already distinguish between normal forest sounds and potential threats, could follow complex scent trails, and showed the kind of protective instincts that made them valuable partners for the homesteaders and miners who were slowly repopulating the high country. He's a natural teacher, Eli replied, watching Moses demonstrate how to approach a suspicious sound without triggering defensive reactions. Figures a dog who learned everything the hard way would want to make it easier for the next generation. The territorial marshal had arrived 2 weeks after the mine confrontation, bringing with him federal warrants for the surviving members of the Dalton gang and official recognition of Eli's role in ending their reign of terror. The reward money, substantial enough to buy supplies for several winters, had been donated to the construction of a new school in Cedar Falls, with the stipulation that it include classes on wilderness survival and mountain safety. Eli had been offered a position as a federal territorial scout, recognition of his unique knowledge of the high country and his proven ability to handle dangerous situations. He declined with thanks, explaining that his calling was to protect this particular piece of the mountains rather than range across the entire territory looking for trouble. But he had agreed to take on apprentices. The young man working in the garden below the cabin was the first, Johnny Martinez, whose father had been killed by the Dalton gang and whose mother had asked Eli to teach her son the skills he'd need to survive in country that didn't forgive mistakes or ignorance. At 17, Johnny was learning not just hunting and survival techniques, but the deeper lessons about reading the mountain's moods and understanding when to fight and when to fade away into the wilderness. Moses had appointed himself as Johnny's primary instructor in the subtleties of tracking and threat assessment, treating the young man with the same patient attention he gave his puppies. The dog seemed to understand that knowledge had to be passed on to be truly valuable, that survival skills died with their practitioners unless they were shared with the next generation. "The Hendersons are coming up next week," Sarah said, referring to a family of homesteaders who'd been driven from their claim by a group of claim jumpers. "Word's gotten out that you and Moses can handle problems that the territorial law can't reach." It was true. Over the past 3 months, Eli and Moses had developed a reputation as protectors of the high country, the people that decent folks turned to when conventional law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't help. They'd recovered stolen livestock, tracked down missing children, and dealt with the kind of human predators who thought isolation made them untouchable. But the real healing had come through simpler means. Every evening, Eli would sit in this same rocking chair and read Martha's letter aloud to Moses and Sarah, sharing his wife's wisdom about love and loss and the courage required to build something beautiful in a world that seemed designed to tear down everything good. The words had become a kind of prayer, a reminder that healing meant honoring the past while remaining open to the future. As sunset painted the western peaks in shades of gold and purple, Moses gathered his puppies for their evening patrol of the cabin's perimeter. The routine was the same one he'd established months ago, but now it included teaching the young dogs how to work as a team while maintaining individual initiative. "Listen," Eli said to Sarah, tilting his head toward the valley below. From Cedar Falls came the sound of children playing, their laughter carrying on the mountain wind like music. The town was growing again, attracting families who valued the kind of safety that came from having protectors like Eli and Moses watching over them from their mountain sanctuary. "No more echoes," Sarah observed, understanding what Eli was hearing. "In those distant voices." "No more echoes," he agreed, reaching over to take her hand while Moses led his pupils through their lessons in mountain wisdom. "The loneliest sound in the world might still be your own voice, echoing back from empty mountains." But Eli Boone no longer lived in that kind of silence. He'd learned that healing came not from avoiding connection, but from finding the courage to care again, to protect something larger than his own wounded heart. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and below them, the mountains settled into the peaceful darkness that came when good people slept safely under the protection of those who understood that some things were worth fighting for.